A few years ago, I made a video about the representation of mental health and mental illness in video games for a school project, and it was terrible. Today, though, I want to revisit that concept and talk more specifically about how a variety of titles convey mental health uniquely through game design. I think the best place to start is with my favorite 2D platformer of all time, Celeste, which is about a girl named Madeline who decides she wants to climb a mountain to conquer her fears and feel a sense of accomplishment. On a more surface level, the game does a great job of representing anxiety, especially through its portrayal of panic attacks and Madeline's constant self-doubt in her dialogue. However, I think what really captivated me about it is how it used difficulty and certain gameplay mechanics to complement Madeline's character arc. The most obvious example can be seen through the existence of her evil counterpart, Madeline, who is at first portrayed almost as an antagonist. She's constantly telling Madeline that she's in over her head and tries to physically impede her progress, but ultimately she's just a manifestation of her pessimistic mindset. When Madeline finally learns to embrace this side of her rather than conceal it, it gives her a second dash that literally makes it possible for her to reach the summit, as the last few sections of the game require the extra dash. It's interesting how gameplay and storytelling align in this instance, increasing the competency of the protagonist as well as the player. In terms of difficulty, Celeste is extremely forgiving when it comes to checkpoints, and you're sure to die several hundred times or more on your first playthrough. However, I don't think Madeline herself is actually aware of her constant dying. Rather, the game's difficulty as a platformer coincides perfectly with her struggle to overcome internal and external challenges. A similar quality can be attributed to Sable, an open-world game where the titular protagonist has to leave her home village and undergo the process of gliding. This requires her to explore the world, meet new people, learn new things, and eventually decide what she wants to do with her life. Sable doesn't talk much, but through her internal narration and interactions with others, it's pretty obvious that she is justifiably intimidated by the implications of this rite of passage. Many of the residents of the villages and settlements she encounters are either young and ambitious, or old and deprived of the liveliness they once displayed, and there's an interesting contrast between them and her. She still feels unprepared for the journey she is currently embarking on, whereas the little kids around the world are eager to begin their gliding despite not being anywhere near old enough. Sable herself takes on a similar role of admiration for those who have already completed their gliding, as they seem much more experienced and calculated than her. She is tentative and metaphorically lost. To complement this, the desert of Midden is vast, filled with Goliath structures and large stretches of wilderness, causing it to be a fitting backdrop. Essentially, what I'm getting at is that her external voyage of gliding directly mimics her internal voyage of self-discovery. What's really incredible about it as a game is that the road to the final objective is non-linear. After you complete a certain number of missions, you'll receive a message that allows you to return home, select a permanent occupation for Sable, and complete the story. However, I imagine I wasn't the only one who delayed that ending until I felt like I had figured out what was right for her, and this uncertainty evoked by the option to finish the game puts the player in Sable's shoes. For a more concrete depiction of mental illness, look no further than Spec Ops The Line. It's a tactical third-person shooter set in a conflict-ridden Dubai where the protagonist, Captain Martin Walker, and two other American troops are sent to rescue innocent civilians and army men by killing thousands of terrorists and corrupt soldiers. It starts off as a typical action game that tries to make the player look and feel badass, but as the story progresses, reality starts to kick in. Walker continues to slip into insanity with each atrocity he commits, defending them as means of self-defense that will contribute to a greater good once the rescue mission is complete. His death toll does catch up with him psychologically, though, which leads to some compelling and gruesome sequences that hit pretty hard due to the immersive nature of video games. That said, the more striking and controversial aspect of the game's portrayal of PTSD is how it attempts to force Walker's baggage onto the player. It has some cheeky ways of doing this, like the loading screen messages which morph from tidbits of lore and tips into introspective questions such as, do you feel like a hero yet? And the US military does not condone the killing of unarmed combatants, but this isn't real, so why should you care? It tends to seem pretentious, because obviously you shouldn't care about killing fake people in a video game. Not only that, but the player isn't given the option to avoid any combat encounters or spare any lives, so you do have to kill numerous unarmed combatants in order to beat the campaign. In its defense, I don't think it tries to make players feel bad for killing enemies and pursuing the main objective, rather for the likelihood that they did all these things without questioning their potential consequences. Most people who played Spec Ops The Line years after its release went into it with the knowledge that it wasn't a typical military shooter though. Truthfully, it's only stood the test of time because of its brutal depiction of unjust warfare and PTSD, so that guilt trip doesn't work at all on most players. Regardless, there is something unsettling about how its central mission continues despite the deteriorating mental state of its protagonist. I also massively respect Spec Ops The Line for even trying to say something meaningful, as the vast majority of video game stories do not. Up to this point, I've exclusively discussed titles where mental health issues are largely relevant to the protagonist. Arguably the most iconic depictions of mental health in video games, though, are the levels of the 2005 cult classic Psychonauts, as they take place in the minds of other characters. The game flirts with using that framework to create some really interesting episodic stories in its first half, but it really hits its stride when you get to the levels in the Garden of the Insane Asylum. The most famous of these is the Milkman Conspiracy, where you delve into the brain of the asylum guard, who is a paranoid schizophrenic with multiple personalities. His mind is this old-timey suburb with gravity-defying twisted roads that reflect his warped perception of the world. Its poorly disguised spies who imitate roles in society suggest that he believes everyone is out to get him, and their vague deadpan dialogue contributes to the level's overall tone of artificiality. Black Velvetopia might be my personal favorite, though. It's the mental world of a former wrestler with a history of severe anger issues who tries to sidestep his past and his rage by taking on the more peaceful hobby of painting. Instead of confronting his problems, though, he buries and runs from them, and this causes him to ruin his works of art by subconsciously painting bullfights over them, which represent the anger he built up for his high school girlfriend who cheated on him. The boat rampages through an alleyway in the level to prevent the player from progressing without defeating all the sub-bosses and breaching into parts of Edgar's mind that he'd rather keep concealed. Another level where gameplay mechanics have a role in conveying a mental illness is Gloria's Theater. Gloria is a forgotten actress with severe mood swings, and her mind takes the shape of a playhouse where a critic yells at her constantly, and there's a stage light with the comedy and tragedy masks on opposing sides. Flipping this light changes the number being rehearsed on stage, but it also drastically changes the attitude of Gloria herself, and ultimately represents her emotional instability caused by her bipolar disorder. Meanwhile, the critic's harsh commentary is Gloria's inner voice scolding her for not being good enough. I could definitely talk more about how the game's interesting premise serves as a genius foundation for some incredibly thoughtful level design and storytelling, but the bottom line is that Psychonauts does a great job of metaphorically portraying mental health issues. I love it for that, which is why Psychonauts 2 was somewhat underwhelming. Don't get me wrong, I think it's an excellent game, but it uses symbolism much less cleverly and frequently, and the mental health issues it explores aren't quite as interesting as the ones in the first game. Some of this can be owed to the sequel releasing in a more diplomatic world, where stereotypes of mental disabilities are more frowned upon. Looking back on the original, I could definitely see it being considered problematic, as it does feature some highly exaggerated and fantastical depictions of mental illness. I know there's a handful of games I haven't played that use similar tactics to convey similar issues, most notably Hellblade, but even from the titles I just talked about, I think there's a general theme of using gameplay to symbolically portray mental health, and I think they're pretty successful in doing so.